The Joe Rogan Experience.
But I think, the terrible truth of the matter is that wars sometimes have to be fought. In the United States, you fought two huge wars, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, in order to deliver yourselves into something resembling freedom. In the United Kingdom, we had a civil war that lasted more than a decade, which is what made us a democracy.
Right, but that's not really the question, right?
But what I'm saying is that what Israel has decided, and I think they are right, is that in all those wars I've just mentioned, by the way, there were huge numbers of civilian casualties. Even pre the modern era of bombs falling from planes, there were civilian casualties.
Of course.
But there's a moral judgment that sometimes has to be made, which is that do we go and fight these people, or do we allow them to regroup and potentially plot another attack on us? And Israel has taken the decision, and I think it's probably the right one, that we have to go and fight these people, just as Britain took the decision that it had to go and fight the Nazis, and just as America took the decision that it had to go and fight the slave owners. Sometimes you have to make a moral judgment. And the thing is, war is awful, but John Stuart Mill, a great liberal thinker from the 1800s, he made the point that war is an ugly thing, but it's not the ugliest thing. The lack of patriotic feeling, or the lack of a belief that anything is worth a war, is worse. And I do think we're seeing that in the West now, this revulsion at war. We are in a very luxurious position in the West, especially younger generations. They've never had to fight for anything. They've never faced an existential threat from a neighboring army that wants to destroy both your state and your religion and your people. They've never faced that level of threat. And what's more, from an army that hides in ordinary streets, in crowded communities, amongst ordinary people. So there's this kind of luxurious moralism, I find, in some of the condemnation of Israel, coming from young people in Europe who've never had to fight for anything, never had to fight to maintain their existence, never had to fight against an existential threat to their entire way of life. What's more, these young people in Europe, their great-grandfathers shoved Jews into ovens. And then they have the absolute gall to say to Israel and to the Jewish state, well, why do you need your own country? They need their own country because of what we did to them 80 years ago. So there is this, it's not just hypocrisy, it's not just double standards, it's this kind of luxuriant condemnation coming from people who live in very comfortable, peaceful societies, who seem to have no understanding that every now and then your society is confronted with a threat that cannot just be wished away. It cannot be peace negotiated away. It cannot be diplomacied away. It has to be confronted in the most physical manner imaginable. And the consequences of that will always be terrible. But sometimes it has to be done.
And that's the only way to do it? The only way to do it is to bomb the places where the civilians are because the bad people are there as well. And I know what you're saying about the condemnation of Israel, and I agree to a certain extent. But could you imagine? I mean, we're essentially in some sort of a strange conflict with drug cartels in Mexico. Now imagine if that didn't exist 20 years ago. I never heard about it. But now we hear about it every day. What if 20 years from now it becomes even more intense? And what if some drug cartels in a gang sneak across the border and kill a bunch of Americans just because they hate America? If we bombed Mexico into the Stone Age, do you know how upset people would be? If we bombed factories because the cartels had embedded themselves in the factories and we killed tens of thousands of innocent workers who were just poor people, do you know how upset people would be? They'd be very upset. It just hasn't happened before. So this unique condemnation is because we're seeing it. We're seeing the consequences of this. And when people look at what's happening to Gaza, like, how does that come back?
Yeah.
There's nothing left. Is just getting obliterated. And what does that mean? What does that mean for the future? What does it mean to the people that live there? What is being done to help them? Is it a death sentence to tens of thousands of people or 1 million people? Like, what is going to happen in 2, 3, 4 years? What if this keeps going on and on?
But this is why it's very unfashionable these days to make moral judgments. You're not supposed to make a moral judgment. You're either supposed to calculate everything according to what its consequences might be, or you're supposed to take this very technocratic view of society. You're certainly not supposed to judge people's identities and so on. So I know it's unfashionable to make moral judgments, but sometimes a moral judgment has to be made. And I think in relation to the Israel-Hamas war, the way I see it is that this was an assault on ordinary civilians by a barbaric army, the like of which people in the West don't understand and don't have to confront. And Israel made the moral judgment that it had to pursue it in the way that it considered best. Now, the thing is, you talk about the numbers, and a lot of people talk about the numbers, and people will often say Israel has now killed more people than Hamas killed on the 7th of October, and that's true. But this is not just a numerical equation. This is not just something that can be done on an abacus or on a pie chart. This is bigger than that. This is a bigger moral conundrum. And there is no moral equivalence, in my view, between what Hamas did and what Israel is doing. Because Hamas intentionally killed people on the basis of their race. It intentionally stabbed people to death. It intentionally threw hand grenades into safety shelters in which families were hiding. It intentionally raped and stripped and murdered women. It did it on purpose, intimately, face to face, with knives and guns and bombs, because they are Jews. Right? That was a fascistic assault on Israel. What Israel is doing, and I don't accept the idea that they are purposely targeting civilians or that they kill those aid workers on purpose. I just don't think that's true. So so what Israel is doing, there is collateral damage to Israel's just pursuit of Hamas. And I just don't think there is any serious moral comparison between the intentional murder of Jewish people and the absolutely tragic, regrettable deaths of civilians in war, as has happened in every war in history. They can't be compared. So I do think we have to go slightly beyond the numbers, beyond the horror of it, which we see on our TV screens every day, and ask ourselves, what is the moral question at stake here? Does Israel have the right to exist? And if so, does it have the right to fortify itself against this anti-Semitic army that wants to destroy it? That's the moral question. And then there's a broader moral question for us in the West, which is, why have so many of our young people in particular and the educated elites been sucked onto what I would consider to be the wrong side of this question? We used to think that education was the great guard against hysteria and regressive views. We used to think that education would deliver people from ignorance, deliver them from the prejudices that might have afflicted our less educated forebears and ancestors. But what we've had since 7th of October is very often the most educated people making excuses for the most regressive army on earth. And so it raises questions for our societies. What's happening in our academies? What's happening in our universities? What's happening amongst our young? What's happening on social media that is sucking people into this myopic hatred for Israel? Why are people like Aaron Bushnell burning themselves alive in the name of Palestine? We have to look at what's happening in our society and make a moral judgment there, as well as, I think, having a moral understanding of why Israel thought it had to pursue Hamas in this way.
There's absolutely no defense of Hamas targeting Jews and killing them. No one could say that there's any defense. But the idea that killing innocents in order to get to the bad people is morally superior. You kind of have to make the judgment that you care about them less than you care about your people. Because if you could imagine a scenario where a Jewish hospital had Hamas in its basement, and they made the decision to bomb the Jewish hospital and kill all the Jews inside of it just to get to the 40 or 50 Hamas guys that are there, no one would say that that's okay. So if you're saying that these people who have no say in how their culture is run are less valuable in terms of like what you care about, what happens to these people, that had nothing to do with it. We care about the people in Israel. They had nothing. They got parachuted in, killed, and at a rave. It's horrifying. But it's also horrifying for the people that have zero say in how their society is run. They're young, and they're women and children, and they're getting bombed into oblivion because where they are is where Hamas is. If those were Jews,
whose fault is that?
But it's definitely Hamas's fault.
Yeah.
But the problem is deciding whose fault doesn't make it feel better for the people that feel it's a moral outrage that you're destroying tens of thousands of innocent lives. And who knows how many people are wounded permanently, and who knows how many people are displaced. Their life will never be the same again. And it's all happening because the moral decision is that in order to get rid of these bad people, you're willing to kill these innocent people that are not us.
But the truth of the matter
But
is...
isn't that true? Because
That's
if they
true.
were Jews, if there was 500 Jews and 3 Hamas guys, who would be cool with killing all those innocent Jews to get to the Hamas people?
But what you're saying is technically correct, but I can think of no war in history, and it is important to talk about the history of conflict.
Yes.
I can think of no war in history where there haven't been civilian casualties in pursuit either of an unjust cause, like the pursuit of Saddam Hussein, apparently because he was responsible for 9/11, bullshit, built on lies, built on a tissue of misinformation, and hundreds of thousands of people died and suffered as a consequence of that. So wars are either fought for unjust purposes and civilians die as a consequence, or sometimes for just purposes and civilians also die as a consequence. So the English Civil War, right, were the parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell wrong to fight against the royalists and to create the modern idea of democracy because there were civilian casualties? I would say no, they were not wrong. They made the right decision. Was the Civil War in America wrong? I don't think it was. I think destroying slavery was a great cause and worth the sacrifices that had to be made. So what I'm saying is that Israel is now facing a similar dilemma that our societies haven't faced for a very long time. There hasn't been a war inside the UK, unless you count the war with Northern Ireland, of course, from 1969 to 1994, for a very long time. So Israel is facing a similar dilemma. What do we do when we face this existential threat? Do we defend our right to exist? Do we fortify ourselves against the siege of these anti-Semites against us? And they've decided that this is a war that they have to fight. I do think the consequences of the war are tragic. I do think the unwillingness of certainly the activist class in the West to apportion any blame to Hamas whatsoever is very, very interesting.
But that's kind of a straw man, because there is that, but then there's also the vast majority of people who look at it as a horrific loss of life of innocent people. And just to chalk it off to the horrors of war, it's like that's the only way to do it? Is this the only way to do it, to bomb civilians because Hamas embeds itself in civilians? I don't know. I'm not an expert on war tactics.
But it's not. I don't think it's the only way to do it. You're right to say that if one were just to throw one's hands in the air and say, it's war, what do you expect? That's not a good response.
Right.
That's not a good justification for what's happening. But what I'm saying is that beyond what I'm saying is, I think, twofold. The horrors of war attend every war. That's a given. Every war is horrible and sick-making and hellish. That's a given, I think. But then there's another issue, which is the question of why a war is being fought. Is it being fought for criminal reasons and wrong reasons? And I think there are many examples of that, spearheaded both by your country and mine over the past 100 years. Unjust wars that led to unjust deaths. Are there also wars that are just and that are worth fighting? Yes. The war against Nazism, I think, was a just war. I think I can think of anti-colonial wars in which it was completely justifiable for people to rise up against British rule or American domination or whatever else it might be. So we do have to make a moral call on what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And that does involve rising above the differences in the numbers killed. It does involve rising above the horrors of war and trying to take a broader view which says, do we want Israel to continue existing? Do we want the Jews to have their own homeland? And do we want them to be safe from the fascistic menace of a neighboring army that would like to kill them all and to destroy their state from the river to the sea? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. And if our answer to those questions is yes, then we do have to accept Israel's right to pursue Hamas. And then the blame for the horrors in Gaza has to lie at the feet of Hamas, which is with profound cynicism, placing itself amongst the people in order to then throw its hands in the air and say, look what evil Israel is doing. It's killing these people, even though they put themselves there for that express purpose. The cynicism of it, the horror of it, is unimaginable. And so I think to put it all on Israel, as some people do, to say this is just a demonic action by the Jewish state is wrong. Hamas bears profound responsibility both for starting the war, and also for putting Gazan civilians in harm's way, and refusing to pull the plug on the war, which it could do right this minute if it returned the hostages and surrendered to Israel. So we do have to look at who is morally responsible for this calamity, and I think it's Hamas.